I want to begin by talking about the moment of clarity, what I can only describe as a revelation. Not in the vague metaphorical sense, but a moment so pointed, so unignorable that it disrupted the usual noise of thought. I wasn't seeking it. I wasn't in prayer asking for some grand prophecy. It came uninvited, yet unmistakable, like a lightning strike on dry ground, July 28, 2025. That date was imprinted with such weight and precision that I felt a physiological response. Heart rate slowed, vision sharpened, everything else went quiet. It was as if the mind had been cleared of its clutter to make room for something sacred, something beyond me. Now, I understand the skepticism. We live in a culture dominated by rationalism and material evidence. We have reduced the spiritual to superstition and the symbolic to psychological coping. But what I experienced wasn't vague intuition or emotional projection. It had the clarity of a command. And when I say God showed me, I don't mean I heard an audible voice from the sky. I mean there was a confluence of conscience, vision, and truth that bypassed my own narrative and imposed itself as realer than anything I could fabricate. From a psychological standpoint, you could say it was archetypal, like something from the deep structure of the soul rising to the surface with authoritative force. The vision itself wasn't cinematic or theatrical. It wasn't designed for spectacle. It was structured, ordered, and deeply human in its symbolism. A figure, once at the center of power, now removed. Not violently, but definitively. The kind of removal that can only be initiated by forces beyond institutional mechanics. It was as if a hand reached down the layers of bureaucracy and influence and simply said, no more. And with that, it was done. You have to understand that this wasn't a message for mere speculation. This was some esoteric puzzle to ponder. This was a directive, a moment where the veil between the seen and unseen grew enough for something eternal to pass through. And it changed how I view power, how I view timing, and most importantly, how I view silence. Because when something like that enters your awareness, you don't just go back to small talk. You carry it, and it carries you. This brings us to a critical point that can't be overlooked. There are times in life, and this is one of them, when something must be said not because it's popular or safe, but because it is true. Truth, when it arrives unfiltered, is rarely comfortable. It disrupts, it reorients, and if you've been entrusted with it, even reluctantly, you become responsible for what happens next. So, I say this not to alarm you, but to awaken something deeper. July 28, 2025 is not just a date. It is a signal, a line in the sand. And you must ask yourself, what will you do when the voice of eternity whispers into the timeline of man? When I refer to him, I'm not speaking merely about an individual in the biological sense. I'm speaking about a pattern, a structure of power embedded in a person, yes, but more significantly in an idea, a psychological construct. Him is a symbol, an archetype, the embodiment of kind of leadership that is no longer sustainable. You see, power without humility tends toward tyranny, and tyranny eventually collapses under the weight of its own falsity. That collapse isn't always immediate. In fact, it can look like success for a disturbingly long time, but it's a fragile success. It's brittle. And when the divine, or you might say the truth itself, decides the time has come, that brittle structure shatters. From a psychological perspective, him is the shadow king, the one who ascends to authority not because of virtue, but because of manipulation, coercion, fear, and the carefully constructed illusion of strength. He doesn't lead, he dominates. He doesn't serve, he consumes. And for a while, people will follow that kind of figure, especially when they're afraid or desperate. It satisfies a primitive longing for order in chaos, even if the order is pathological. But that form of leadership always leaves something essential behind the soul of the people. And that, in time, becomes the very thing that resists and overturns it. Philosophically, this is the age-old struggle between the false sovereign and the true one. You can trace it through history from Pharaoh, Egypt, to Saul in Israel, to Caesar in Rome. The false sovereign always rises with charisma, control, and promises. But over time, the gap between what he claims to be and what he actually is becomes too wide to ignore. That's the moment of crisis. That's when people start to wake up, not all at once, but gradually and then suddenly. And when enough people see it, the fall is inevitable, because power derived from fear is unsustainable. It has no roots in truth, only in force. And force, for all its impact, that can never outlast the human longing for freedom and meaning. Now, let's be clear. This isn't about demonizing a person. This is about naming a principle. Because if we make it about a name or a face, we risk missing the deeper lesson. Him is not just out there, he's also in here, within each of us. The temptation to dominate, to control, to bend others to our will, that lives in the human psyche. And unless we confront that shadow in ourselves, we will continue to elevate it in others. So, this removal from power isn't just a political event. It's a mirror. It's asking all of us, what kind of power do you submit to? What kind of authority do you validate with your silence? The figure removed on July 28, 2025 represents more than a man. He represents a failure of character disguised as leadership. And if we don't learn from that, we are doomed to repeat it. With new names, new faces, but the same corrupt spirit. So here's the question: when false power falls, will you simply watch? Or will you rise to become what it failed to be? Dates, when spoken by God, or when they emerge from deep symbolic insight, aren't random. They're not trivia. They're not placeholders. They're markers in the fabric of reality. July 8, 2025 is not simply a moment in time. It is a pivot. And I want to be clear, Harek. I'm not talking about fate in the deterministic sense, where all things are fixed and humans are just puppets on a divine stage. I'm talking about a appointed time, what the Greeks would call a kairos. The opportune moment, the spiritually ripe hour, when what has been building beneath the surface finally erupts into the visible world. The kind of moment where everything changes. Not just because of the events themselves, but because the conditions that allowed those events to happen have matured to completion. Psychologically, we live in cycles. Individuals go through seasons, stages of Greek rebirth. So do societies. But what we often miss is that these cycles aren't just mechanical. They're moral, they're spiritual. And when a culture tolerates deception long enough, when it elevates hollow men to high places, when it praises rhetoric over wisdom, eventually, the internal contradictions reach a breaking point. That's when the system can't lie to itself anymore. That's when truth, suppressed and buried, begins to erupt. The date I received, July 8, 2025, is in my understanding such a rupture point. Not because the clock hits a number, but because the conditions for collapse, for accountability, and for realignment have reached their threshold. This kind of moment doesn't come often, and when it does, it reveals what was previously hidden. That's the frightening part, because it doesn't just remove the figure in power, it exposes the mechanisms that upheld him. The enablers, the fearful, the apathetic, the ones who knew better but stayed silent. And it's in that light that we're given a choice, either to remain passive as the old crumbles, or to step into the responsibility of building something better. Something rooted in truth rather than image, in character rather than charisma. From a philosophical lens, this moment embodies the tension between chaos and order. When corrupt order breaks, there's a vacuum, a descent into uncertainty. And that's when people either regress into tyranny again, begging for a new strongman, or they rise with courage and humility to lead differently. This is why the date matters. Not because it's magic, because it demands preparation. It demands attention. Because when time intersects with truth, you either transform or you are crushed by what you refuse to acknowledge. And so, when I speak of July 28, 2025, I'm not pointing to a distant prophecy to be admired or debated. I'm pointing to a reality that is already unfolding, already converging, and fast approaching its visible climax. The warning is not in the prediction. It's in our reaction to it. The clock isn't just ticking forward, it's ticking inward. The question is not whether something will be removed. That's already set in motion. The real question is, what will rise in its place, and will you be ready to face? And one of the hardest things to do, perhaps the most psychologically costly thing, is to say something that you know will disturb people, especially when silence would be far more comfortable. But there are moments when silence becomes a form of complicity. And once you've seen something clearly, you don't have the moral right to pretend you didn't. That's the tension I've lived with since this revelation. It wasn't just that I saw a date, or a removal, or a symbolic fall. It's that I understood what it meant, and with that understanding came an obligation. There's a deeply human instinct to avoid conflict, to preserve peace by not speaking hard truths. In evolutionary terms, that makes sense. We're wired for group cohesion. Survival often depended on not standing out. But here's the problem: if everyone follows that instinct, truth has no voice. And when truth has no voice, deception reigns. That's the philosophical danger of silence. It appears neutral, but in reality, it creates space for falsehood to grow unchecked. Throughout history, the people who shifted cultures, who turned the tide of nations, were not always the ones with influence or authority. They were often the ones burdened with inconvenient insight, the ones who were haunted by the cost of saying nothing. You see this in the prophets of the Old Testament. These weren't polished figures delivering carefully curated messages. They were, more often than not, reluctant, uncomfortable, even despised for what they had to say. Jeremiah wept, Jonah ran, Elijah hid in a cave. But what they all had in common was a recognition that remaining silent in the face of truth was not an option. Not if they wanted to live with themselves. From a psychological angle, this is the confrontation between conscience and comfort. Conscience speaks softly, but it doesn't let go. It gnaws at you. It interrupts your peace. It reminds you that you know, and that knowing creates responsibility. And if you ignore it for too long, you don't just lose your voice. You lose your soul. You become fractured, bitter, cynical. And you start to rationalize your silence as wisdom. But it isn't wisdom. It's fear in disguise. So when I speak now, it isn't because I want it to be right, or admired, or even believed. Frankly, I would have preferred to stay quiet. But the weight of this insight, the clarity of that moment, left no room for that. When you're given a vision, a truth that pierces through the fog of ideology and fear, you either bury it and rot from the inside, or you speak and carry the consequences. And yes, there are consequences. People won't always understand. Some will mock. Others will distance themselves. But none of that compares to the internal collapse that comes from knowing you betrayed the truth that was entrusted to you. So I'll say it plainly. I am speaking now because I would rather be dismissed for telling the truth than respected for staying silent. The removal of a figure from power, especially one so entrenched, so central to a system, is never just about you, them. It's about you, us. It's about what allowed that person to rise, to remain, and to shape the structure around them. And when that kind of power is shaken or overturned, there's always a deeper invitation, one that reaches far beyond political drama or social realignment. It's a call to repentance, a call to prepare, because the collapse of the false always the emergence of something true in its place. And that responsibility doesn't rest on the next leader. It rests on you. Repentance is a word we've stripped of its meaning. It sounds archaic, moralistic, almost uncomfortable. But at its core, repentance is psychological recalibration. It's the confrontation with where you've gone astray. Not just in action, but in orientation. It's the honest admission that you've participated, perhaps unconsciously, in something that's led to destruction. And when a nation, or a culture, or even a family comes to a moment like this, where falsehood is being peeled back, everyone is forced to ask, how did I contribute to this? What did I ignore, tolerate, or enable that allowed this corruption to thrive? That question isn't easy. It requires a level of humility that doesn't come naturally to the ego. Most of us would rather scapegoat, blame the system, the other side, the one person who failed. But that's not growth. That's deflection. And if we only ever blame him, we'll just create space for a new version of him to emerge again. Different name, same pattern. The only real antidote to that is personal transformation. You confront your own cowardice. You examine where you've chosen comfort over truth. You take responsibility, not for everything, but for your part. And preparation flows from that same mindset. When something old is crumbling, the question isn't just what will replace it, but who will. And more importantly, who will build what comes next. That's the heart of preparation. It's not just waiting for the dust to settle. It's cultivating the inner strength, the character, the moral clarity to be ready when the moment demands more of you. Because those moments always come. They test what you've become. They reveal whether you've done the inner work or simply watched history unfold from a safe distance. The psychological reality is that people don't rise to the occasion. They fall back on their preparation. So if we see a shift coming, and I'm telling you that shift is already in motion, then the time to prepare is not tomorrow. It's now. Spiritually, mentally, morally. Because if we don't rise in responsibility, the vacuum will be filled by someone who will. So let me leave you with this. When the counterfeit is removed, the question isn't just what falls, it's who rises. Will that be you, or will you remain where you've always been? Safe, quiet, untested. One of the great illusions of our time is that human power structures are ultimate. That they are untouchable, impermeable, beyond the reach of anything except internal decay or external revolution. We've come to believe that institutions, regimes, and systems operate in a self-contained vacuum where influence, money, and political strategy dictate all outcomes. But history, and more importantly, human experience, says otherwise. There is something higher, something transcendent that doesn't just observe human affairs, but intervenes in them. And whether you frame that as God, as conscience, or as the deep order of the universe, it remains the same truth on why there is no throne that is not ultimately beneath something greater. When I say that God showed me this figure removed from power, I don't mean it as a mystical metaphor. I mean it as a direct challenge to that illusion of human invincibility. Power, when disconnected from truth, is always borrowed. It may last for a time, sometimes alarmingly long, but it is never permanent. Because power rooted in lies, in ego, in fear, eventually collapses under its own weight. And when that collapse comes, it doesn't just reveal the failure of one man. It reveals the limits of human arrogance. You see, real authority, true leadership, is always accountable to something beyond itself. It's oriented toward the good, not just toward control. It understands its limits. It submits to a moral framework, to a transcendent standard. Without that, what you get isn't leadership. It's idolatry. And that's what we've seen. The worship of position, the celebration of dominance, the glorification of the self. But that kind of power isn't sustainable. It's performative. And eventually, reality catches up. Psychologically, this reflects profound truth about the human condition. We crave meaning. We instinctively know when something is false. Even if we suppress it for a time, the deeper part of us, the part wired for truth, keeps noticing the cracks. And when the structure finally breaks, there's a strange sense of both fear and relief. Fear because chaos is uncomfortable, but relief because something untrue has finally ended. Now, the danger in moments like this is to assume that since the false has fallen, the true will automatically rise. It won't, not without effort, not without responsibility, and certainly not without moral courage. The removal of the corrupt doesn't guarantee the emergence of the just. That requires each of us to realign, not just politically, but spiritually. We must choose what authority we live under, not just externally, but internally. So let's be clear, power does not originate with man. It is granted. And when it is abused, it is revoked, whether slowly, quietly, or in a moment. What I saw, what I was shown, wasn't just the fall of a man. It was the reassertion of a higher order. And if that higher order can bring down the seemingly untouchable, then the question you need to wrestle with is this: well, what authority are you living under? And is it one that can survive the truth?